Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, South Africa Beyond the Safari, presented by Nat Hab Expedition Leader, Russell Gerber. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you all so much for joining us here today. Over to you, Russell.
Thank you, Rob. Always a pleasure to be back for another Daily Dose of Nature. Thank you all out there for joining me. And hopefully you get some great information on, well, my favorite country. It happens to be the country of my birth. So once again, a little bit of bias on my part. But today, as the topic suggests, we will be going into all the relatively obscure areas of South Africa, areas that are not always visited on a trip to come out on safari in particular. And hopefully today I can entice you to come and join us for a safari and then tag on some of these wonderful other wildlife and cultural adventures that are available in our wonderful rainbow nation. So thanks again for joining us, and let's get started. So as always, I'd like to just introduce myself for those of you who don't know me, especially since today we don't have the webcam. I'm coming to you from Morgan Bay, an area on the wild coast of South Africa, which we'll talk about in just a little while. So signal is not entirely great from here, but there I am on a recent safari with Natural Habitat, as you can see, with a beautiful African elephant hanging out in the background. I've been with Nat Hab since 2018 and I've had a great time with them thus far. I guide all over Africa, from South Africa to Botswana, Uganda, Rwanda, Madagascar, and also East Africa. I'm sorry, I was just trying to remember the other places that I guide as well. And of course, many, many places here in South Africa. Over the years, though, I've been a safari guide since 2007 and a marine field guide since then as well. And my history is actually more in marine science, though I always had a passion for the safari industry and life on safari, and found myself working as a safari guide, as I said, since 2004. Have an undergraduate degree in zoology and postgraduate degree in marine biology, as I mentioned. So a lot of time in the field, and it is certainly a passion of mine. There's nothing more that I like to be out in the field and on safari anywhere in Africa or anywhere in the world if it brings me that way. But just a little bit about myself, and hopefully one day I get to meet some of you and you can join us on a wonderful trip here in Africa or somewhere in the world. So today's topic, as we spoke about, is beyond the safari in Africa. This is just a photo taken of Cape Town, where I live. That is my wonderful pooch playing in the ocean in the foreground there. But as I like to do in all of my webinars, I just want to go through a little bit of the sort of structure of what we'll be chatting about this evening, starting with the wildlife hotspots of Africa. I'll show you all of this on a map so that you get a feel for where these areas are or occur. We'll go through what that wildlife is and the cultural highlights of each of these areas. We'll go through when and how to get there for your best chance of experiencing some of these wonderful animals and adventures. And then lastly, what to expect on a trip if you do decide to come and join us down here in South Africa for a safari or any one of these other adventures. Now, many of you will know that is, of course, Africa. And we today are talking about that green country right down at the bottom of Africa, South Africa. And to focus in a little bit more on exactly where we are, there you see South Africa surrounded by ocean, and to the northwest we have Namibia, north of us Botswana, Zimbabwe in the northeast, and in the far corner of the northeast, Mozambique. So those are all of our neighbors, and as you can see, a country that is quite diverse and with a number of great wildlife hotspots, which is of course our focus for today. Now, many of you will know the most renowned wildlife area in South Africa, certainly from an international point of view, and that would be the Kruger National Park. But today, and on this map, I wanted to give you an idea of the wonderful other animals that you have the opportunity of seeing here, and also a little bit of why those animals occur where they do, and very much what drives the climate of South Africa. So the thing that really has the largest influence on our climate is really the two ocean currents that flow past our coastlines. And here you can see in red on the right-hand side of your picture, and in blue on the left-hand side of your picture, those two ocean currents, as I mentioned. So coming down from the equator on the east coast of South Africa, we have the Agulhas current. It is actually quite a fast-moving current at certain locations. It moves around 2 meters per second, which is really quite rapid for such a large ocean current system. It is obviously very warm water that comes down from the equator. It's sort of channeled between Madagascar and the African east coast, and then comes down past our east coast of the country. On your left-hand side, you'll see the big blue arrow, which demarcates the Benguela current, a very cold water and slow-moving current that moves up from the Southern Ocean up the west coast of South Africa. That brings with it cold water, very high in nutrients. And what you get in terms of the two oceans is that on your left-hand side, the Atlantic Ocean, on your right-hand side, the Indian Ocean. The Atlantic, in this particular case, along our coastline, a much higher biomass in terms of your fish species and fisheries that are predominantly found on the west coast of South Africa, whereas on the east coast, that warm current brings with it, of course, great diversity and some of the southernmost occurring coral reef systems in the world, which we'll dive into a little later in our webinar this evening. Now, those two currents not only provide the basis for a number of different species from an oceanic or marine point of view, they very much drive the climate of South Africa. That cold water around the Cape, in Cape Town, and in the bottom left-hand corner of South Africa, you could call it, that of course drives a climate that is very similar to a Mediterranean climate, very dry and warm to hot summers, and then very wet and cold winters. As you move up towards the northeastern part of South Africa, however, it changes from that Mediterranean style climate to a much more subtropical style climate, where we tend to have dry, cold winters and then very wet and hot summers. So as you move into the northeast, as I said, towards Mozambique, you start seeing that much more tropical weather system. And around the safari areas that we'll be discussing today, the vast majority of them, the rainy season is generally in the summer. And we'll go into some more detail on that a little later. But firstly, I wanted to show you in the little lion prints that you can see coming onto your map right now. These are some of the, in my opinion, the safari hotspots for South Africa. Now, as I said, today we will be moving on to more of beyond the safari, but I did want to touch on some of the lesser known safari areas too, that we do actually visit on one of our Nat Hab trips, and also other areas that you might consider visiting if you did come on a trip to South Africa. And we'll go into detail on each one of these little paw prints as we go through our webinar this evening. But we got to start with the main one, which is Kruger National Park. But before we get to that, on the same map, I wanted to give you a feel for what we're going to be discussing in terms of other species. Here you see coming in now are the little sharks, not so little if you consider the size of them in real life, but we'll be discussing various shark species, in particular white sharks or great white sharks. And you can see here, this is where are mostly the best areas to see them if you are interested in seeing these wonderful predators or apex predators of the ocean. And again, we'll go into some more detail of their distribution, but these are some of the best locations roughly to see them along the coastline of South Africa. You can see now some dolphins coming in as well. Now, very much the entire coastline of South Africa is inhabited by dolphins, but these again are some of the best areas to see them if you do intend to come and visit. And then whales, of course, another very popular species. Again, just some of the best areas to see them. This is the shape of a sperm whale. We don't actually get sperm whale too often coming around our coastline, but again, we'll go into some detail of what those species are. And then, of course, Cape fur seals, generally up the west coast, occurring all the way across to Gqeberha, which used to be called Port Elizabeth on this particular map. Again, we'll go into some detail on that. Right up in the northeastern corner or border of the country are more tropical species, and in this case, turtles that actually do their nesting in the northeastern part of the country. And once again, we'll go into some more detail on those as we move on in our webinar. And lastly, the penguins, or African penguins, found around Cape Town, the Cape Peninsula, also all the way across to Gqeberha. The best place to see them, certainly around Cape Town. Those are the various species that we'll be focusing on today, but we'll be looking at more of an overhead look, if you could say that, of the areas in which you're likely to find them and what is so special about these areas as we go through them. But like I said, first and foremost, we got to kick off with the Kruger National Park. And for many people, easily the most recognizable wildlife area in South Africa. This was actually taken in the Kruger National Park, a beautiful male leopard. You can see a wonderful silhouette of him sitting up in the tree as we watched on from our game drive vehicle. And Kruger, of course, is just an absolutely magical place. One of the things that it is most famous for is its incredible size. Coming in at roughly 5 million acres, it is the largest national park in South Africa, and also a part of it is the oldest national park in the country. So a lot of history there, and with that, of course, these animals have enjoyed protection and safety for the most part for in excess of 100 years of protected wild and natural environments. So in many cases, and many of the individual animals are quite relaxed around humans, quite relaxed around vehicles, and so we often get some of the best big mammal game viewing in or on the continent. And it is home, of course, to the Big Five, very much a marketing term these days, but initially a term that was given to the 5 most dangerous animals to hunt, when back in the day, of course, safari was much more about hunting than it is today in terms of the wonderful photographic safaris that we offer. That Big Five, of course, being leopard, as you see in this picture, lion, elephant, rhino, and buffalo. So those are the Big Five, and often what people want to see most when they come out on safari. The Kruger Park being so huge and in actually increasing its size in the last 20 years or so, dropping fences with our neighbors in Mozambique and in Zimbabwe. It is actually known as a trans-frontier park. So just increasing the wildlife or wild area that these animals can traverse. And of course, as I mentioned, an incredible diversity of wildlife, particularly mammals, with some literature actually pointing out that it may well be have the highest concentration of mammal species in a national park in Africa. So an incredible place to visit from a wildlife point of view, particularly if you're a fan of the furry mammals. A broad array of biomes, of course, providing various environments for these animals to live, from savanna to riverine, broadleaf woodland, even some rocky mountainous areas within the national park. Absolutely incredible diversity that allows for a huge array of species. As I mentioned, it's also one of the best areas for viewing large predators here in Africa, and in this case, of course, leopard. And I would say, and I'm sure many of my colleagues out there would agree, it is one of the best places to see leopard in the wild. One of the most secretive and special animals to see on safari because of the longevity of protected areas in the Kruger Park. They tend to be very relaxed, as I mentioned. Generations of leopards that have been grown up around Land Rovers and Land Cruisers, that they've become very relaxed and habituated to those vehicles, and they don't run away. So you often see them in their natural environment behaving as they would even if you weren't in the picture at all. So a really, really wonderful place, and certainly one of my favorite safari areas. Here you can see a picture that I took on the edge of the Sand River, one of the places that we visit on our trips to the Kruger Park, if you do ever come and join us. And in terms of when you should visit, the wonderful thing about Kruger is really any time of year is a good time to come. This was towards the beginning of spring, so not too long ago that we were actually there. And you can see a little bit of greenery coming through. We were right along the edge of the river, so a lot more water in this area. As you moved away, it got a lot drier. But as you go into the summer, which is from around about December until February, that is very much the rainy season, and often a little quieter in terms of the number of visitors to the region. Still excellent for game viewing. The only challenge can be slightly longer grass and not as easy to see them. One of the wonderful things about Kruger National Park and many of the areas we'll be looking at today is that they have a lot of private reserves where you can go off-road to view these animals. What we can do in these areas, of course, in Kruger, mainly game drive. Early morning and afternoon game drives are what your most common activity would be. Also, walking safaris are very common for either getting out just to see some of the tracks, spoor, and dung of various animals, even concentrating on insects, flowers, trees, etc., even to birding for those who are very keen birders. And today would have you up early in the morning, normally at sunrise, heading out on game drive for about 3 to 4 hours, depending on what we see, coming back for a little breakfast and a siesta in the middle of the day, heading out on drive again late afternoon, and coming back in the dark. So you get a short little night drive in each day as well in the private parts of the reserve. Getting there pretty easy, flying into South Africa, into Johannesburg, then a short flight from Johannesburg into Kruger directly in Xhosa of about 1 hour and 20 minutes. Otherwise, a drive of about 6 hours from Johannesburg. So very easy to access. Another reason why it's become so popular. And here you can see another wonderful shot of an experience of going on game drive just as you're heading into the evening, generally after a wonderful sundowner stop, having a drink in the bush, gin and tonic or a club soda or whatever you'd prefer, and then you head out on your night drive as you slowly make your way back to the lodge. So one of the most wonderful places to head on a safari, and some of the most recognized private reserves in the area, the Sabi Sands, Thorny Bush Game Reserve, Pafuri right up in the north of the Kruger National Park, which is quite unique, and many others, of course, that are just as special and offer, one of the most famous wildlife experiences on the planet. And we do, of course, touch on the Sabi Sands in our particular trip, the secluded South Africa trip. If you do want to join us on one of our scheduled departures, but of course, any one of these spots we can look at from a Nat Hab point of view for a tailor-made safari to South Africa. The next spot we have to look at from a safari point of view is the area just adjacent to the Kruger National Park, going a little further west, and this, of course, is in the Limpopo province. And I'd like to focus quickly on the Marakele Reserve and surrounds, one of my favorite places to visit on a safari, and of course, another great place to see leopard. And as you can see, another shot that we managed to get of a beautiful leopard out on safari. Another private reserve, quite secluded and a little bit off the beaten track when it comes to the number of visitors to the area, and is often a place that is forgotten when people come for a visit or a safari in South Africa. The reserve itself, much more conservation focus in its experiences, and of course just protecting the land that the private reserve is on. And so you get a lot of different experiences, from the opportunity to dart a rhino for research purposes, to help with game capture, again for research purposes. So a lot of conservation focus on this particular property, and that is, what really makes it quite interesting. Alongside that, often, of course, are walking safaris and enjoying time in the quiet away from your vehicle. Night drives, because it is, of course, a private vehicle, or private reserve, excuse me, and of course, river cruises, which is quite unique in terms of a safari experience in South Africa. And it really is a wonderful river cruise where you can often see things like elephant, sometimes lions, buffalo, and of course a lot of the smaller aquatic species that you can possibly see on the water. And here you can see a picture of that. This was part of our, or out on the edge of the river before our river cruise. And one of the great things about the Marakele Reserve is those beautiful mountains off in the distance. So just a different type of landscape to what you would see at Kruger, but with equally wonderful wildlife experiences and a little bit of diversity in terms of your activities with the boat cruises, walking safaris, as I've mentioned as well. So a wonderful place to visit and something you should seriously consider, and again, is part of our secluded South Africa trip. The next one, also part of the South Africa secluded trip, is Madikwe. And again, I'll just briefly touch on these as we move through all these wonderful areas in South Africa. Madikwe was traditionally famous for a number of wild dog that they had, of course, a critically endangered species. And it was a wonderful and has always been a wonderful place to see wild dogs. And our last trip out there, we were fortunate enough to see them yet again. And I managed to get this lovely shot of them just as they were on the hunt. Sorry, just gone back a quick, and we're back at on our wild dog. And Madikwe, for me, another very special area and often forgotten about as a stopover destination or something to include with a trip to Kruger National Park. What makes it so interesting is it's a very different kind of environment from what we've seen in the Kruger and even in Marakele. This is technically a meeting zone of two different biomes in terms of the low veld and the Kalahari thorn veld. So you get quite a lot of desert influence in parts of the reserve, where in others are much more kind of riverine and savanna influence. So quite different adaptations for the species. So once again, you tend to see mostly the same species with a few antelope species that are more adapted to a drier environment. What's so special about Madikwe, of course, is that it has the second largest elephant population after the Kruger National Park, and it's the largest elephant population on a private game reserve. So really, really interesting from that point of view. And if you like elephants, it's certainly the place to go. Once again, it is known for its private safaris, and we can indeed go off-road and do night drives in the area, which allows a lot more calm access to the animals, unlike many of the national parks in other parts of Africa where there isn't really a limit on your sightings. All of the reserves that we've just spoken about have the wonderful advantage of being on private property, and generally your sightings are limited to 3 or 4 vehicles per sighting. So you never get crowded, you never feel like you're in a rush, and you know, you can actually really enjoy your sightings, whether it be something as simple as watching lions sleeping or something as crazy as watching wild dogs hunting. Now, Madikwe is home to what some call the Magnificent Seven, which is the big 5 that I mentioned earlier. The Magnificent Seven includes cheetah and wild dog. And in the other reserves we've spoken about, except for Marakele, you can indeed see the Magnificent Seven in the Kruger National Park as well. And then moving on to the desert. Now, the wonderful expedition leader and colleague Lorraine Doyle will be chatting about the deserts tomorrow night on the Daily Dose of Nature. So do check that out as well. So I won't go into too much detail on the Kalahari or Kalahari, but it is certainly something that we need to consider if you are coming on a trip to South Africa. The Kalahari and the Kalahari region is really one of the most interesting safari destinations in South Africa. And again, not one that people visit readily. It's not really a true desert. It does actually receive a significantly more, well, not significantly, a little bit more rainfall than is generally associated with a desert. The climate, as I said, varying from extremely dry to slightly wetter, winter being the dry season, and the rain usually falling during the summer months from October to April. So very much, as I mentioned, towards the northern parts of the country, you see that more subtropical weather system. Heading down towards the Cape, you see the more Mediterranean style weather system. The Kalahari, of course, is is home to many desert adapted species, including this beautiful female meerkat who was sitting up on a hill in front of us and enjoying the morning sun on a cool or cold early morning game drive. And here just a scenic shot that I took of the Kalahari region. And as you can see, certain times of the year, this was taken during at the end of the wet season. You can see a pretty healthy covering of grass, which can support quite a large number of herbivores in certain locations. As it gets drier, of course, those herbivores are forced to move away in mini migrations, not quite the size of East Africa, but certainly something that is worth taking note of. Some of the special activities you can do in these regions are, of course, horseback safaris, Khoe-San tracking experiences, which is an incredible experience with some of the local tribes and groups who've been in the area for tens of thousands of years and mastered the art of tracking. And some of my favorite cultural and walking experiences have been with these various Khoe-San tribes, taking you on an experience into the Kalahari bushveld. The habituated meerkats, so the meerkat picture that was in our previous slide, that of course was taken from one of these groups of habituated meerkats where they've just simply gotten used to the presence of people. They're still completely wild, but you get to view them in their absolutely natural environment, up close and personal without disturbing them. And then another attraction for the Kalahari area, if you're lucky enough to see them, is of course the black or dark maned lions, which is often a very big attraction for that area. Now heading back towards the coast, and some of the areas that we'll be chatting about now combine a wonderful experience of both safari and wilderness, and marine wildlife experiences. Brought in here that red arrow indicating the warm ocean current again of the Agulhas current coming down the east coast, and you'll see our lion print paw in the top left corner of South Africa, almost on the border with Swaziland and Mozambique. This is an area known as Zululand, and Zululand is a magnificent wildlife hotspot of South Africa, including some of the most wonderful game reserves, which we'll go into in just a little bit, and of course some of the most wonderful wildlife, marine wildlife, in the form of dolphins, turtles, loggerhead and leatherback turtles in particular, green turtles occasionally as well, and coral reef systems, all the way through to freshwater species like crocodiles and hippos. One of the few places in the world where you can actually get hippos, crocodiles, and sharks all in the same water. So not a place I would suggest to go swimming, but a beautiful destination to visit without a shadow of a doubt. As the name suggests, Zululand is the home and traditional home of the tribal group known as the Zulus, which many of you would have read about in your history, who played a very important role in the formation of the provinces, current provinces of South Africa, and one of the most dominant tribes in Southern Africa over the centuries. The Sihluwe-Mfolozi and Isimangaliso Wetland Park, those two national parks form the core or the backbone to the protected areas of this region. The wetland park, as it suggests, the wetland from freshwater lakes and Lake St. Lucia to the beautiful marine ecosystems. And Sihluwe-Mfolozi was one of the first national parks to really focus on the protection of rhino during the 70s, at a time where many other areas, the rhino numbers were declining rapidly. Sihluwe-Mfolozi really were thinking ahead, and today it's become one of the best areas to view these wonderful and endangered animals. Still an endless plight that they have to fight against poaching, of course, in those areas and the potential for poaching, but Sihluwe-Mfolozi and Zululand still one of the best places to see rhinos in the wild. So as I said, a unique marine and safari wildlife hotspot, an area where I started my safaris many moons ago in 2004. And actually the reserve that I started in, known as Pinda Private Game Reserve, was one of the best places and still is one of the best places to view cheetahs in the wild in South Africa. But again, an area with wonderful diversity when it comes to the vegetation, from these beautiful rocky outcrops to sand forest, marshland, savanna areas, broadleafed woodland, you name it, you can find it. As I mentioned, the entire Zululand area renowned for viewing cheetah and rhino, much more of a subtropical climate again, so that's summer rainfall as we mentioned, and because of that subtropical climate, we get a lot more tropical bird species that do visit in the summer as well, and in a wonderful area to visit in terms of any of you birders out there. This was a shot taken many moons ago, working at a lodge up in the Zululand area. And you can see a young Russell chatting to guests about a beautiful female loggerhead turtle who was laying her eggs right near us on the beach. And one of the most wonderful experiences that you can do if you are into marine wildlife or simply into wildlife at all. We would head out onto the beaches in the early evening and into the evenings, and formed part of an ongoing research program of the loggerhead and leatherback turtles in this case, and a project that is still ongoing today. And as I said, just an incredible experience all round. Of course, you stay well out of the way of the turtles as they're making their way up the beach. As they start digging, you can actually approach them from behind. They go into an almost trance as they dig the hole for their nests. As they lay the eggs, you can watch, take photographs. We often then would measure the carapace of the turtles so that we can, of course, add that to our database. And all that information together over the years has played a significant role in aiding the protection of these species and the protection of the beaches in which they lay their eggs. So again, a wonderful, wonderful experience that many people don't often associate with South Africa when they come on a safari. If you do happen to visit in the summertime, from around about October, November through to February, you have the potential of seeing turtles. The best time for seeing them laying eggs is around December, and then seeing the hatchlings coming out tends to be around about January to February, where you can get the opportunity of seeing those little turtle hatchlings making a break for it back to the ocean. And just another shot of me when my time spent on that coastline. Another pastime that people are quite fond of course, is fishing. I'm a horrible fisherman, but it is something I like to do if I have the time, and it is certainly a great place to do that. Up in that northeastern part of the country, of course, is a tropical system, and many of the areas, or many of the inshore areas, are home to coral reef systems, attracting some of the most wonderful marine species, including whale sharks, manta rays, and of course many other large pelagic species, and the beautiful coral reef species that you often see associated with the coral reef systems of southern Africa and Africa. This, of course, a honeycomb eel, which was always fun to see out on a dive. So for those of you who are into scuba diving, yet another special activity you can look forward to here in South Africa. Now, moving on to our next location, into the Eastern Cape. As you can see, our little lion print again, a wonderful area for game viewing as well, for safari, and of course an area where you get the opportunity for seeing sharks, whales, and dolphins on the coastline. And the area we'll focus on today in terms of safari in the Eastern Cape is the Kwandwe area, or Kwandwe Game Reserve, Kwandwe Private Game Reserve. The Eastern Cape is often referred to as frontier country. When the Boers started moving their way through the country, moving away from the Cape after the arrival of the English, they started to, of course, move into areas that were generally uninhabited. But as they moved further northeast, there were more and more clashes with the local inhabitants in that particular area, predominantly, which were the Xhosa people, of course, the home or native tribe of Nelson Mandela. So an area that is famous, of course, for the birth of South Africa's favorite son, but an area that is also very, very well known for its wildlife and wonderful cultural history. The Eastern Cape itself is very much characterized by its aloes, succulents, and the scrubland that you see almost as far as the eye can see, but also it is influenced by massive rivers, in this particular case, the Great Fish River, and in the area where I am now, and actually sitting to you guys, talking to you from, very close to the Kai River, These river systems, of course, play an integral role in providing water into what is often a very dry area, particularly during the winter months, as we've been experiencing over the last 3 to 4 years with quite a severe drought impacting the Eastern Cape as it stands. With that, of course, is the coastal system, and the marine coastal system in this area is really teeming with wildlife, particularly this time of year. As you can see here, this is a bit of a landscape shot that you can see of Kwandwe in the Eastern Cape to give you a feel for the kind of arid environment or scrub land environment that you can expect to see if you come and visit. But as the last two pictures suggest, a wonderful area for seeing the critically endangered black rhino, and of course home to the big five, and at the moment home to what may be the only ever recorded wild-born cheetah cubs, and it's a litter of 8. We've never ever heard of 8 cubs being born to a wild female before. I certainly haven't, so we're all keeping a close eye on them to see if they make it. One of the great things about the Eastern Cape, of course, is that it's malaria-free, which plays right into the ability to bring your kids along for a safari into South Africa, and is one of the big attractions of going on safari in the Eastern Cape. Again, slightly off the beaten track, so not as busy as many of the other areas that we've mentioned. And again, the opportunity for private game drives and private walks in the reserve, and many conservation experiences as well. Another thing that this area is famous for is, of course, the wild coast, named for the wild oceans and ocean currents on often very steep cliffs and rocky shores as you go down the coastline in this region. But with that is very little development and wonderful, wonderful marine life that you have the opportunity of seeing if you do visit this area. And some of the most popular experiences or pastimes in the Eastern Cape being hiking, many trails that you can do over a few days, walking along the beaches and coastline of the wild coast, often not seeing people for days, which is very, very special. Fishing or angling, diving as well, scuba diving, and again, birding for those who are very keen on their birds. Some wonderful locations for birding in the region. And at certain times of the year, we've just gone past it really now, but normally around July, August and September, this area is often inundated by the sardine run, a wonderful and an exceptional wildlife phenomenon that happens only here in South Africa. The movement of quite literally billions of sardines from the south coast up the east coast of South Africa that are followed by thousands upon thousands of marine predators, from, in this case, common dolphins all the way through to whales and of course sharks. And it is certainly one of the most spectacular wildlife experiences you could ever witness, and something you should certainly look into if you're ever coming for a visit to South Africa. And actually a topic that I might do an entire webinar on, because it is so special and so unique, and something that has become quite famous for South Africa as a holiday destination, but still extremely adventurous and something you should certainly consider if you're coming to visit us. Another great attraction of the Eastern Cape, and moving on soon into the Western Cape, is the whales that you are very likely to see, particularly this time of year. Mostly humpback in this case, in this photograph, and southern right whales are our most common whale species that you could possibly see down here, which brings us neatly along to the West Coast and Western Cape. These are cold water current again, and as you would imagine, that cold water current influences the waters to be much cooler on the west coast of South Africa, or the Atlantic Ocean side of South Africa. We've been looking at the Indian Ocean in the Eastern Cape, now focusing on the Atlantic Ocean and the wonderful species associated there. As I mentioned, the entire Western Cape, probably the best area in Africa for sure, possibly the world, to see great white sharks in the wild, though these days that's getting more and more difficult. Wonderful dolphin viewing up and down the coastline, and Cape fur seals all the way from into the Namibian coastline, all the way down to Cederberg, as you can see in the northern part of the map here, you get these Cape fur seals occurring, and those two whale species. And of course, for many, one of the most popular species to see in the Cape is the African penguin. So finishing off, and what many people like to attach to their safari is, of course, Cape Town and the Western Cape with those wonderful wildlife species that I just mentioned. This is, of course, Table Mountain, Hori Kwacho, to the Khoe-San tribe, or the ancient name that was given to Table Mountain by the Khoe-San tribes, which means the mountain in the sea. The wonderful things that you see in this area and in this particular photograph, from left to right, is the peak of the mountain. On the left is Devil's Peak, Table Mountain, the flat one, as you can imagine. Off to the right, you can just see it off shot, is Lion's Head, and off in the distance, 12 Apostles, with the city bowl sitting below that, as you can see where all of the buildings are. And some of the attractions in the city, of course, are the Company's Garden, various historical sites and museums, and of course, Cape Town, home to some wonderful restaurants if you are a keen foodie. And going up and down the mountain is, of course, one of the most popular activities that you can do in the Cape and in Cape Town. And abseiling, or what do you guys call it in the US, rappelling down the mountain is quite popular. Not for me, I'm not a big fan of heights, so you can look into that if you're interested, but it is something that they offer on Table Mountain as an experience when you're visiting the area. And of course, going back up, climbing the mountain, another very popular activity. For those of you who prefer their more relaxed activities, wine farms and wine tasting is of course very popular in the region, with some of South Africa's oldest wine farms occurring in the region. And Pinotage, a unique varietal to South Africa, a red wine that is quite heavy bodied, but not quite as heavy as a Cabernet. Unique to South Africa, as I mentioned, is something you should definitely try on your next visit to South Africa. And I can definitely help you with picking out some good Pinotage when you're visiting the area. But one of the major attractions, of course, on a cultural basis is visiting the various old wine farms here in South Africa. Penguins are an eternal popular species, as I mentioned, and in this case, the African penguin, which you can visit at Boulders Beach, about half an hour outside the city of Cape Town. So very easy access. And if you go at the right time of year, generally during the winter months, from about June through to September, you can get some really good time with the penguins without it being too busy. And as I said, these of course are African penguins. Used to be called jackass penguins because of the call that they make that sounds like a donkey, but today known as the African penguin. As I mentioned as well, a great place for viewing the Cape fur seal down in the Cape. In this case, this was actually on a seal snorkeling trip, which you can do as an experience down in the Cape. Often you'll be inundated and surrounded by these young seal pups. The snorkeling is done in very shallow water. It's quite chilly, so they do give you a wetsuit, but a fantastic experience if you're keen on getting wet and getting in the water. This seal dive or seal snorkeling just outside Cape Town, or outside the city, again about 20 to 25 minutes outside the city. Simply wonderful, and definitely something I would recommend you look into. And as I said, this is of course the Cape fur seal, or the brown fur seal, and the distinctive feature, of course, is that they have these external pinna, or it looks like ears on the top of their head. And in this area, the largest of all of our fur seals, coming in at around 250 kilograms, and they occur all the way up to Namibia. Now, on the menu for the great white is, of course, those Cape fur seals, and that is what brings many of our large great white species to this area. And if you're interested, you can look into doing a cage dive and potentially see some of these giants swimming very nearby you if you're very lucky, or depending on how you feel about great whites, unlucky. But it is a unique experience. These days, as I mentioned, it has become harder and harder to see them as fish stocks have dropped off in the major fishing areas for the sharks. but there is a lot of evidence to show that the arrival and almost taking up residence of a number of killer whales or orcas along our coastline outside Cape Town and along the west and east coast surrounding Cape Town has driven many of the white sharks further up north to escape the predation from those orcas, which is quite unique, and again another very interesting topic that we can look into. So the great white is of course the most sought after species if you are coming out here. There are a number of other species that you could look into or that you might get lucky enough to see, including bronze whaler or ragged tooth sharks, but of course the great white is the most interesting, being one of the largest predators in the ocean, up to over 2 tons. And again, one of the interesting things about them is that they often travel very, very long distances, often from, or recorded traveling from South Africa to Australia and back again in 1 year, particular female that actually did that. So a unique and interesting species, often very intimidating for many people, but in my opinion, one of the most beautiful animals out there. And I've been fortunate enough to actually do these cage dives and see some white sharks. And again, an experience that I really hope you get to enjoy one day. Although, as I say, these days, getting harder and harder to see them from the cage dives. So just a couple of shots of these beautiful species that I wanted to show you. And again, a species you could definitely look into checking out if you're lucky enough to come and visit us. Some of the other things that you can look into doing around the Western Cape on a visit, as I mentioned, are shark cage diving, but diving the kelp forests around the Cape as well, which I actually often do in my spare time. You're welcome to join me on one of those where you can enjoy some wonderful soft corals, the kelp forest itself, and of course the potential of spotting some beautiful pyjama sharks on a dive, some beautiful pelagic species, potentially tuna or even marlin that you can see on a dive, and for many, the most popular Cape clawless otter. You are very lucky, but it's not very common to see, and every now and again, West Coast rock lobsters as well. So much to do in South Africa, folks, and so many places to see. I wish I had more time to talk to you about it, but unfortunately, I only have an hour to do so. So if you would like to join us on one of these wonderful experiences, sitting out on the beach up in the northeastern parts of South Africa in this particular shot, enjoying the warm tropical breeze and a little drink or two and some snacks on the beach, please do get in touch with our team. And you can always get in touch with me as well. We can chat about any potential of these unique South African experiences that you could enjoy on a visit to the Rainbow Nation sometime in the future. So as I say, unfortunately, that's all I have time for, and I'd love to answer some of your questions. So thank you very much. Rob, have you got anything for me?
Thank you, Russell. Before we start with the question and answers, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. So let's get to some questions that we do have. So can you talk a little bit about walking safari, such as how long the walk is, how many people, how do you stay safe, things like that?
Absolutely, it's a great question. And something that a lot of folks get put off by, but the walking safaris are, we generally squeeze them in between our drives. Obviously on game drive, you can go quite a lot further and you focus on the big animal species. On a walking safari, we're generally not tracking big animals, though depending on the group and depending on what people want to do, we can actually track big animals. We can track things like rhino, sometimes elephant or buffalo, even lion in certain reserves as well, if you're interested in doing that, but they'll never do anything you're uncomfortable with. The guides that will go out with you are, of course, highly trained, and they will go out armed. The purpose of the rifle is an absolute last resort. Our guide training is all about understanding the environment and doing everything in our power to not ever have to use the rifle. And in fact, the perfect wildlife viewing on foot is if we can actually track that animal on foot, view it without it ever knowing that we were there, and then we're coming back out again out of the sighting. So the way it would work is we generally do it after the game drive in the mid-morning when it's still slightly cooler. The walk could be anywhere between 1 to 2 hours, depending on how you feel and how hot it is. As I said, we would focus on various things, but the purpose of it is to get out of the vehicle, away from the noisy engine, and the feeling of being in the bush without that vehicle around you is just so special, and for me, a highlight of the trip. So that is generally how we would operate our walking safaris.
Well, thanks for covering that. Is Kruger National Park in Mozambique, is that a place that Nat Hab goes?
As far as I know, no. We don't have a scheduled trip that we do there. But again, if you're interested in doing that on a bespoke or tailor-made trip, we can absolutely look into it. Some of our guides, actually Jeff Trollope, who guides for us up in East Africa, he spent years out in that area as well, and he could give some great information. I actually haven't done Gorongosa yet. I'd love to. It's very much on my list, but I haven't experienced that. So if you're interested, yeah, absolutely get in touch. We can look into getting some great accommodation and experiencing Gorongosa if you're interested.
Great. That's great to know. Can you tell us what the purpose of a rhino's horn is? Is it defense or fighting or drawing a mate?
All of the above. So it is used for defense. From a female point of view, she'll use it to protect her baby or a calf from any potential predator, even from other male rhinos occasionally. And then in terms of territory and fighting over females, the males use the horns for fighting. Generally not to the point of being lethal, but often incurring some pretty severe injuries when they do fight, particularly males that are very evenly matched in size. So that's the majority of what they would use the horn for, occasionally for feeding as well, but that's not as common. And they also utilize it sometimes for marking or scent marking, or where they will actually rub their horn on a stump, and that can actually leave a scent that other rhinos can follow. So it is certainly something that they do utilize. I know that many people wonder about the dehorning of rhino as a conservation tool, how it impacts the animals. And sadly, it absolutely does. It's why many reserves when they do have to dehorn their rhinos, the horn does grow back. They try to do as many of the rhinos as they can in the area so that none of them have an advantage over the other. Because of their size, they don't tend to have a lot of natural predators, so the horn can be cut off in those particular areas without too much impact on their life.
Great, thanks for covering that. Can you talk about the condition of the coral reefs in northeastern South Africa? Is there a lot of bleaching?
There is bleaching, as I'm sure you know, whoever's asking that question, there's a very global phenomenon and global issue that we're dealing with from a coral reef perspective. Because of the southerly nature of our coral reef systems, the water hasn't warmed significantly to the point where we're actually seeing mass bleaching or large-scale bleaching of our reef systems. So for the time being, it's in better condition than many other locations towards the equator. But we're still absolutely seeing the effects of bleaching on a smaller scale for now.
Great, I understand that. Let's get back to the trips for a second. Are there any trips that focus more on the botanical plants and animals?
It depends on you, the guest. For myself as a guide, and wherever we go on any of our trips, we will always focus on whatever you're interested in. And though I will never claim to be a professional botanist, especially around the Western Cape, I've looked into understanding the surroundings of where we live, and becoming a guide in that area. You do learn about the various plant species. And down in the Cape Floral Kingdom, of course, is one of the most diverse floral kingdoms in the world. And so we do learn a little bit about those things and often incorporate that into our daily guiding around the Cape in particular. Now we go into certain wild areas up to Namakwa land in the west coast, in the Cape as well during the spring, where we have wonderful spring floral blooms. And then around the Cape itself, the fynbos, which is the local Cape Floral Kingdom, the local name for that, that we do focus on quite a lot, with various species blooming at different times of the year. So we often have the opportunity to at least touch on those things, and visit to Cape. We'll often also visit the botanical gardens, which are, unlike many other botanical gardens, actually quite wild, and mostly a wild garden in itself. It's merely curated without too much exotic species actually being planted in the garden. So depending on where we go, depending on your interests, yeah, we will focus on botanical things, but there is no particular trip that is 100% focused in Africa, certainly on a botanical focus, let's say.
So can people swim with whale sharks?
Again, depends where you go and depends on the time of year. In that particular instance, in that photograph, it happened to be luck that we were in the water at the time. We were actually snorkeling, and the whale shark came right between us. So for the most part, and responsible ecotourism, we would never really approach whale sharks in that area. It is part of the Isimangaliso Wetland Park, so there are rules and regulations about approaching marine species, particularly bigger species like that. We just happen to get lucky. So the truth is, it's not a common experience, but it is possible visiting that area, heading out for various snorkeling and or diving excursions onto the reef systems. Those species come through there, so there's every opportunity that they can and do arrive. So as I said, that particular shot in this webinar was actually a photo of my wife. It was after the dive, and that whale shark arrived just as we were ending the dive. So we dumped our gear into the boat and we just hung around in the water until she swam away, which was unbelievable.
Wow, so exciting. So if I was a first-time person going on a safari, is there a particular safari or country you would recommend going to?
Well, South Africa, I would say. For me, it touches all bases. I think, for your first safari, the Kruger National Park is certainly an area that you could look into. I've just had my father-in-law from the USA come and visit, and we sent them on their first safari to the Eastern Cape, an equally beautiful and gorgeous area. So it really depends on you. Most visitors to South Africa tend to do the Kruger National Park first. And if you have a limited amount of time, I would certainly recommend South Africa as a destination for safari, because you can often then also incorporate many of these, or even just one of these other wonderful activities available in South Africa. So from my personal, totally unbiased point of view, South Africa is definitely the place to go for your first safari.
I thought you might say that. Well, that's going to be the last question that we do have time for today, Russell. So I'm going to throw it back to you for your closing comments.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you all once again for joining us. I do hope you enjoyed our little webinar this evening, and a little taste of the wonders of South Africa. As always, I hope to see you again soon on the Daily Dose of Nature. If not, I certainly hope to see you in the field on a trip with us in Africa. But until then, I'll see you all again soon, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your week.
Russell, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I would also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. If you're interested in information on how you can travel with Nat Hab, give us a call at the number on your screen or send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out registration links on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.